Hey guys, this is Blue Forest. I hope you're doing well. So today we're doing part 4 of the SIG 100 list, where we're looking at each SIG in the game by class, and we're taking a look at these SIGs at low SIG level, but then again maxed out at SIG 100, so that you have some more information when you're deciding which bots to dupe and where to feed those precious 5-star SIGs. Because obviously it does take a very long time to get any bot up to a very high level, and so you want to be careful and strategic about who you're choosing to invest in. We're also looking at things like activation rate. I am not ranking these SIGs, but we want to look at them in isolation from their bot, because some SIGs will be more beneficial to you than others, and some will activate a lot more often than others. So with that said, we're going to do the Tactician class today, and we're going to start with OGM. So Megatron, his SIG is No Mercy. This is a very game-changing SIG in the sense that it really changes OGM. He does need to be awakened in order to steal buffs, which is a very unique ability to him. It's different than a bot like Nemesis, who simply copies buffs. OGM can steal all kinds of different buffs, and this is the thing that really, more than anything, makes him one of the best bots in the game for long fights like LOC, because he can steal all kinds of buffs: armor buffs, attack buffs, melee buffs, repair buffs, special damage buffs. I mean, a long list of buffs, and in some fights it makes him an absolute monster. So obviously you're fusing debuffs, right? So you're landing specials, then fusing debuffs with heavies, and then you can steal buffs with your melees. At SIG 1, he has about an 18% chance to steal a buff that goes up to 60% at SIG 100. Now, 18%, low SIG level might not seem like much, but you have to remember that because he is stealing buffs with melees once the opponent has fused debuffs, you're doing lots of melee attacks, lots of combos. And so the really good thing about this SIG is that it has a high activation rate even at fairly low SIG, because you're doing lots of melee attacks, and you will find that he's able to steal buffs fairly consistently even at low SIG level. So you want to awaken him and dupe him a couple of times, work on his SIG somewhat if you're going to use OGM a lot, but he does not need to be maxed out at all. My OGM is about SIG 45, and I don't feed him SIGs anymore because he's able to steal those buffs pretty consistently. So it's an excellent SIG in every way. High activation rate, does not need to be super high, very effective, very efficient, and it'll help you out quite a lot. So that brings us to Ultra Magnus. So his SIG is All for One. This is a very unique and circumstantial SIG in the sense that it is entirely contingent upon the team that is with you. Most SIGs obviously do not operate in this way. So gets one of 2 buffs or both of them, depending on the team. So if more teammates are alive than dead, or he's alone, he's going to get a 20% physical resistance. If, however, more teammates are dead than alive, or it's tied, he's going to get a 20.6% attack buff at SIG 1. If all teammates are dead, he gets both the physical resistance and the attack. At SIG 100, the attack, which is the only thing that increases with this SIG, goes up to just over 96%. So it does scale pretty well. It gets almost 5 times as strong at SIG 100. And it's actually good that it's the attack that goes up, because you're going to get the physical resistance at the same level, no matter if he's at SIG 1 or 100. But more importantly, Ultra Magnus is already a very tanky bot, very defensive, lots of resistances. He can take a lot of damage, he can get beat up a lot, and so his attack is not quite as strong, and so you'd want the attack to be the thing that did increase, and that is the case with this SIG. This is a tricky one, though, because it really is contingent upon who's with you, who's alive, who's dead, so the decision to invest in it will really depend on you. Ultra Magnus is not the most widely used tactician. Most people focus on other tacticians first, but if you were all in on Ultra Magnus, it would be worth it to invest some into his SIG, because you can get that attack buff, quite a bit stronger. That's the good thing. The bad thing, though, is that sometimes you're not going to get that attack buff, right? Because it's all about who's with you and who's still alive. The good news, though, is that you're always going to get one of those buffs. You're always going to get at least either the physical resistance or the attack. But if you want the attack as much as possible, well, you can't control that except, if you start losing bots. There are people who use him in AMs and they'll use him last. So if your other teammates are dead, then he's going to get both effects. And so if you were to work on his SIG, he'd be getting a very strong attack boost. With that said, for most people, he'll do just fine at low SIG, even though the attack boost won't be as high. You'll have a chance to get it, and or you'll be getting the physical resistance. So it's a decent SIG for sure, but you're only going to want to invest in it if you're absolutely all in on him, and if you're okay with the fact that sometimes you're not going to get that attack buff. So that brings us to OGP. So Optimus, his SIG is Breach. This is a bleeds-based SIG. So when the opponents are armor broken, he will land bleeds on the opponent when he crits. At SIG 1, he will deal bleeds for 50% attack over 4 seconds. That goes up to 140% attack at SIG 100. So the bleeds simply become significantly stronger. Now, this is certainly a good SIG in the sense that it has a high activation rate. OGP obviously has lots of armor break with the specials. The Special 3 has that permanent armor break. You can certainly get a lot of use out of this. At the same time, though, it's not as essential of a SIG as somebody like OGM's, because you're basically just making OGP stronger. It does help him out. The bleeds are nice. Certainly if you use deep wounds, which makes bleeds longer, then you're going to be able to amplify that damage even more. It's a very good SIG, but the thing is, OGP is already a fantastic bot, very widely used, has some of the best base damage in the game. So the good thing is that you're going to get plenty of use out of this SIG if he's at SIG 5 or SIG 10. You're still going to get plenty of bleeds. The bleeds will still be pretty good. If you're using deep wounds, they'll be even longer, So you don't have to invest a whole lot into the SIG in order for it to be very effective. If you are a major OGP user, which some people certainly are, then sure, dupe him, feed him some SIGs, and make those bleeds stronger. But he does not need to be at very high level in order for it to be very beneficial. So that brings us to Bumblebee, so DOTM. His SIG is Alacrity. So this has 2 components. First, he gets a melee and ranged speed boost, basically. So he will switch faster between those modes, which you can see when you use him. He's a very fast-paced bot, very agile, evades a lot. And then he also gets an attack buff when he dodges melee attacks for 5 seconds. So at SIG 1, he's getting about a 16% attack buff. This goes up to a 75% attack buff at SIG 100. Now, this is an interesting one because B is a Titan bot. And so that means that, first of all, most people get him late. People will often focus on other tacticians and get other Titan bots first. But it also means, unfortunately, that if you wanted to invest in his SIG, it would take an incredibly long time. It already takes long enough with bots that you can dupe through crystals or through the featured store. But from the Titan store, your only option is to dupe him with Titan fragments, which takes forever, or to feed him those precious SIGs, which we don't get that many of. So it would be an incredibly long-term investment in order to get his SIG high. The good thing, though, is that this does have a very high activation rate because you're obviously dodging and evading attacks all the time. So you dodge that attack, you get this attack buff for 5 seconds, you dodge again, you get it again, right? And even at low SIG, even if it is 16% attack or 20% attack or 25% attack, that's a really nice bonus. And the really good thing is that these work in tandem with the permanent melee buffs that he gets when he knocks opponents down, right? And he can stack those. He can get lots of those buffs, particularly for mid-length and long fights, which is where B really shines. And so, you use that SIG with all of those permanent buffs that you're stacking up, you're going to see really nice boosts of extra damage. So most people will be fine at low to mid SIG. I would say if you like to use him a lot, if you're using Autobot teams, things like that, sure, feed him some SIGs, things like that. But you really don't have to worry about getting his SIG too high unless he ends up being your top tactician, because remember, it will take an incredibly long time to get him to high SIG, but that is fine because of the fact that he's getting these other melee buffs from his normal kit. And even at low SIG, he's going to get this nice attack buff over and over again. So that brings us to Nemesis. His SIG is the Artificial Matrix. This is a simple healing-based SIG where he will heal a portion based upon the amount of damage that he does with his special attacks. So at Sig 1, he's going to heal for 16.4% of the damage that he does. This goes up 25% at Sig 100. So the first thing you notice is that this does not scale at all. It does not even double in strength from low to high Sig. On top of that, remember, Nemesis, like B, is also a Titan bot. It would take literally forever to get his Sig high. The good news is, though, is that you don't really have to worry about that. You don't have to get him to high Sig, because his healing is not going to be meaningful based upon Sig level. If you want to have meaningful healing with Nemesis, that is really about bringing him into the right kinds of fights, particularly fights where he can copy buffs, particularly melee buffs. Nemesis is very much a specialist. He does very well against brawlers and against bots on certain kinds of mods, like the Primal ROTK fight, which Nemesis is fantastic for, right? Because he can copy that kind of buff. If he copies a strong melee buff, then he will do a lot more damage with his specials, and then he will heal a lot more. Against other classes, though, against bots that, there aren't really buffs to copy, generally the healing is going to be pretty low, regardless of Sig level. I've tested this a lot. I have like a Sig 5 Nemesis or something like that. In a typical fight with the specials, he might be healing 2-3% at a time, because you have to land really big hits. A 10k special will heal 1600 health. It's only going to be in those fights where he can copy buffs. This is why you can see in a fight like that Primal fight, sometimes he's healing 20-30%. That's great, but those fights are very limited. Nemesis is very limited in the kinds of fights he does super well in. With that said, there are people that like to use Nemesis and left side of AMs. You've got lots of brawlers, lots of buffs to copy. He can be very effective, but you'd have to be very deliberate about wanting to use him for those specific kinds of fights. So if you do use Nemesis, of course, awaken him, maybe feed him a few SIGs, but don't worry about the SIG after that. It's not really going to benefit you to work on his SIG for a long time. You really just want to make sure that you're bringing him into the right kinds of fights so that he can copy those melee buffs and then increase his damage so that he can heal more, particularly when he gets into trouble. So that brings us to Dinobot. So his SIG is survival of the fittest. This has two components. So kind of like OGP, the opponent does need to be armor broken, but when they are, he will get a flat 20% block penetration with his attacks, his sword attacks, and he will have a chance to go unblockable. So at Sig 1, the next attack will have a 15% chance to be unblockable. That goes up to a 50% chance at Sig 100. It is only the unblockable that's affected by Sig level. The block penetration is the same at low and high Sig. This does work well with his kit. He does have some armor break. He obviously has lots of armor piercing attacks. He does damage with his parry, things like that. So it's a good SIG in the sense that the block penetration is always going to be there. It's kind of similar to like the increased damage that Grinder can do when he's punching into blocks when the opponent has crit rate debuffs. And the unblockable is nice, right? The opponent won't be able to block. You can punch right through it. But the thing is, it does max out at a 50% chance to go unblockable. So you could spend, years getting him to Sig 100, and then the unblockable would only activate 1 out of 2 times. So even if you are a major Dinobot user, most people are going to be perfectly fine with him at low Sig, mid Sig, because you're going to get that block penetration, which will activate relatively frequently, and you'll still sometimes activate the unblockable, and that will certainly help you out. So not really the kind of SIG most people are going to want to invest in, because the unblockable is not ever going to be guaranteed no matter what. But certainly useful, and if you are using a lot of Beast Wars teams, Swordmasters teams, things like that, it'll be a useful SIG, and it'll do just fine at low to mid SIG level. So that brings us to Starscream. So he has Nullify All Hope. He can nullify buffs with that null rate of his, with his ranged shots. So at Sig 1, he has a 20% chance to nullify a buff. That goes up to an 80% chance at Sig 100, so it does scale up to an 80% chance. Now, the nice thing about this is that it has a high activation rate pretty much regardless, because remember, Starscream has a chance to nullify with all of those basic range attacks, and you're obviously firing off lots and lots of ranged shots. So the nice thing is that even at, Sig 10, Sig 20, you're going to be able to nullify reasonably consistently, and he can nullify any type of buff that's on the opponent as long as it's not a mod or boost-based buff. But all buffs that are built into bots, he can nullify, and that's really useful. Again, super useful against brawlers, against tanky bots. You end up doing tons of extra damage. You can see this if you go up against a bot like Primal or MV1. You know, it's just incredible the amount of damage that you can do. And the fact that it has a high activation rate, even if it's at low to mid sig level, makes it even better. So if you are a range-based fighter, which of course is what Starscream is, you like that kind of play style, you know, he's obviously getting those boosts, the range boost with the special one as well. Invest some into his sig, get that null chance up a little bit, but you don't have to worry about getting it up to max sig level because you'll still nullify fairly consistently, even if it isn't a very high sig level. So next up we have Cyclonus. His sig is Dark Servitude. This is another excellent sig because it has a high activation rate, very easy to use. So this simply amplifies his Dark Burn damage. Obviously he is gaining that dark energy and activating the dark field every time he gains a bar of power. He can also pulse the dark field with certain attacks like his special 3, and this works in tandem with, you know, things like his nullification. So it's very well integrated into his kit. At Sig 1, all dark burn damage will increase by 16%. This goes up to 120% additional dark burn damage at Sig 100. That's more than 7 times as much. It scales very, very well. What I like about this Sig is that it's just free passive damage. And it activates all the time, because every time you gain a bar of power, right, you're knocking the opponent back, you're dealing that dark burn. And so if you end up being a heavy Cyclonus user, which some people are, he's obviously a brilliant unstoppable counter. He has other really interesting, useful parts of his kit. If you like Cyclonus a lot, I would invest into it, because every time you dupe him, every time you feed him some SIGs, that dark burn damage is just going to get a little bit higher, you know? And because it's free passive damage, you don't really have to do anything. It just makes it super, super effective. And getting them up to mid-sig level, you don't even have to get them up to Sig 100, but even at mid-sig level, you're going to be seeing lots and lots of extra burn damage. This is a very, very good and beneficial Sig. So finally, that brings us to Rodimus. So we have Arise Rodimus Prime. This is a circumstantial Sig and one that will also be polarizing for some people because it is circumstantial. It is based upon losing health. So Rodimus will get an attack buff for every 10% of lost health. At Sig 1, he's going to get a 5% attack buff for every 10% lost. That will go up to a 10% attack buff at Sig 100. I should mention, this is different from what was indicated in the bot intel report. When he first came out, it indicated that it would be a 5 to a 15% attack buff at Sig 100, but I have confirmed through the showcase and so forth that it actually maxes out at 10%. It only doubles. So this is a tricky Sig because, number one, you have to lose health in order for it to activate at all. You don't have to lose a lot of health, but you do have to lose a lot of health in order to see a significant attack boost, right? So if you have a Sig 1 Rodimus, at 80% health, he's going to get a 10% attack boost. But at 20% health, he's going to get a 40% attack boost. So this works kind of similar to Motormaster in the sense that Rodimus is going to be a lot stronger at low health, just like Motormaster is a lot stronger at low health. This will eventually make Rodimus probably a good candidate to revive in AMs once they fix him. Rodimus does still have a lot of problems. But, you know, he'll be the kind of bot, if you did use him in AMs, you know, if he dies, you revive him back to 20%, he's going to have this really nice attack boost. On the other hand, though, some people are not going to like the fact that you have to lose health to activate it, and that you have to lose a lot of health in order to get a major benefit from it. In terms of Sig level, however, I think most people are going to do just fine having him awaken, maybe duping him once or twice, and that's it. Because remember, this does not scale basically at all. And the attack buff is only going to get a lot stronger by losing a lot of health. This is only going to rise a fraction of a percentage point per Sig level. You know, so it would make no sense to spend an insanely long time trying to get him to Sig 100 just to have double the effect. I mean, you'd have to be 110% all in on him, you know. So for most people, awaken him, you know, maybe get a dupe of him once or twice, and then you'll be just fine, because then that way, when you are at low health, when you do get into trouble, he's going to be getting a very generous attack boost regardless of his Sig level. So it's good in that sense, but for some people, they're not going to like it because of the fact that he's going to be a different bot below 50% or below 20%. So It's circumstantial, it'll be polarizing, but I think the vast majority of people are going to be just fine with a low sig Rodimus. It's not going to be worth the investment for most players. So that wraps up the Tactician class. I will try to get to the remaining 2 classes over the next week or so. Do let me know if you have any questions, and we will speak again soon.